Uh,
Okay, so I want to, last week we left off with with um, pedagogy of the oppressed, chapter 2, and we really just kind of started diving into it just from the beginning, just like really at the very beginning of it. And so what I'd like us to do is kind of go through it if we have it, or talk about kind of some of the concepts that are in chapter 2, and see if there's anything that really kind of stands out to us. And then again, we're going to kind of connect it into, our personal lived experiences and just kind of, the world around us as a whole. So if anybody would like to start, go for it.
Charlene,
Yeah.
you know what? Can I actually start? But this is actually on chapter 1.
Absolutely.
I just thought that it was somewhat appropriate.
Okay.
This is on page 53, and it's the first real paragraph in the middle. It starts with, in dialectical thought, world and action are intimately interdependent, but action is human only when it is not merely an occupation, but also a preoccupation. That is, when it is not dichotomized from reflection. Reflection, which is essential to action, is implicit of explaining to the masses their own action, just as it is implicit in the purpose he attributes to this explanation. He's talking about Lukács, that of consciously activating the subsequent development of experience. And then he goes on, he says, for us, however, the requirement is seen not in terms of explaining to, but rather dialoguing with people about their actions. In any event, no reality transforms itself. And the duty which Lukács ascribes to the Revolutionary Party of the explaining to the masses their own action coincides with our affirmation of the need for the critical intervention of the people in reality to the praxis. I guess I'm saying all of this just to lead to this, because I know that multiple times we've been trying to clarify what Paulo Freire meant by pedagogy of the oppressed. And here he actually says it on page 53, the pedagogy of the oppressed, which is the pedagogy of people engaged in their fight for their own liberation, has its roots here. So again, the pedagogy of the oppressed is people engaged in fight for their own liberation or our own liberation. No pedagogy which is truly liberating can remain distant from the oppressed by treating them as unfortunates and by presenting for their emulation models from among the oppressors. The oppressed must be their own example of the struggle for their redemption. I just thought this was appropriate because of what you just introduced, Charlene, about lived experiences. Right? The point is not simply to just adopt models that are out there, those models that are usually created by those in positions of power who are historically have been the oppressors. So rather than adopting the models that they actually have provided, the idea is those who have been oppressed, those who have been marginalized, those who have been demonized, we actually have to center our experiences and go from there to talk about how reality has been imposed upon us and how we try to navigate that reality. So let me just start with that.
Just kind of going off of that, one of the things that I really liked, so kind of going off of what you were saying, that first line of that last paragraph on 53, it says, for us, however, the requirement is seen not in terms of explaining to, but rather dialoguing with the people about their actions.
Sure.
you know, and I really liked that part because, you know, not to bring it around to the organization, but for, you know, for our organization, very much that idea of like not talking to, right, and not talking about, like kind of the idea of not helping, right, it's working with, it's always in collaboration and truly in like a community effort. And I really like that concept, and I like how, you know, that really does challenge, you know, what he says later on about that kind of that student-teacher relationship as well, which I think so often as educators across all grade levels, we really forget. We really forget.
Sure.
That unless, does anybody else have anything they'd like to kind of say or expand on that? Because I have something that ties into it in chapter 2, but I don't want to jump ahead yet.
I'll go for it.
Okay, so on page 74, where's it at least in my copy, I think it's, I have the newer copy now, but on page 74, it's the second full paragraph. It says, the truth is, however, that the oppressed are not marginals, are not people living outside society. They have always been inside the structure which made them beings for others. That particular part, it always like stands out to me whenever I hear or even use the word like marginalized groups of people, right? And I think it's so important because language is important, and that goes to kind of what you were pointing out too, Che, is about how right, like the point that you, like, oh my goodness, sorry, the section that you read to us, because I think that when we are separating our lived experiences, right, we're contributing to that perceived marginalization, right, because we're pretending like that structure doesn't exist. So, and so long as we pretend that doesn't exist, or that structure does exist but hasn't attempted to push people out, then we're going to just end up continuing this kind of reproduction of, you know, of oppression within education.
Yep. Anybody want to jump in? Declan? No?
I was just thinking about, this doesn't have to really relate to education, so I don't know if it's like off topic exactly. But I was thinking about this. It's funny because I guess it sort of relates to what I was thinking about last night. How not to bring this guy up so soon, but like when it comes to like Donald Trump, I think about a lot of his supporters or people who would vote for him, and they would probably consider themselves oppressed, right? And they would probably look at people like us who are part of universities, and like they would look at us as elite, and they would look at us who are perceived to be more educated and smarter than them as oppressors in a way, you know. And because education has for decades been become increasingly more unaffordable, something like education is seen as sort of like a bougie attribute, you know. And so there's almost pride in being ignorant, and sometimes I think that's what some people, I don't want to just portray all of them that way, but some people in like the Trump camp would sort of like cling to their not that message, but that sort of like identity. And I think it's really important that like we can't just sort of marginalize people like that as well and say, I mean, it's one thing if you're just talking to a friend and say, oh man, like how can anyone vote for that guy, or like they're all idiots or something like that. But you have to be able to lend a hand and to show some sort of compassion if you want them to sort of be on our side, and if we want them to sort of what we would think as becoming better human beings and becoming more educated and stuff like that, you know. So when we just read that little thing talking about like the oppression marginal is living no matter what. So we're doing the oppressing ourselves, whatever it may be, you know? So that's kind of what I was thinking. It was kind of off the topic of like the education system, but that's sort of what I was thinking about.
Can I actually follow up with that, Declan, and may be able to address that again, to go back to page 52. Last week I didn't have my book with me, so I just didn't have all the notes with me. But if you go back to page 52, he actually addresses that almost directly.
Yep.
On page 52, on top, by the way, Charlene, the way they did Paulo Freire's books for every edition, which I appreciate, is no matter who actually published it and how many editions, how many different editions he went through, the pagination is exactly the same.
I'm noticing that.
Yeah, it's really good.
That's awesome.
Yeah, so that's fantastic. So from the very beginning, the 25th anniversary, the 30th, the first, whatever, the page is exactly the same, which is really good.
Yeah.
So if you go to page 52, the top, in the very beginning, the first real paragraph towards the end of the top, it says, to achieve this goal, the oppressed must confront reality critically, simultaneously objectifying and acting upon that reality. A mere perception of reality, not followed by this critical intervention, will not lead to a transformation of objective reality, precisely because it is not a true perception. So in this sense, he says, this is the case of a purely subjectivist perception by someone who forsakes objective reality and creates a false substitute. The reason why I think this fits into maybe addressing some of the things that you're talking about is, rather than, and I guess, you know, that shouldn't be taken off the table either, that we should always be generous to everybody that we meet, of course, right, as a human being. But yes. I think what many of what you mean by poor white folks who are Trump supporters confusing their class position of the marginalized poor, right? Yep. And substituting that class analysis to somehow a racial analysis of minorities are actually now given more. Minorities are given affirmative action, right? It's because of the people who are being educated. Yeah. All of these is what he calls false, right? A false substitute.
Yep.
So what we really have to do is to educate poor white folks about the real objective reality of why they are in the position that they are, right? And the person who could explain that the clearest about their plight is actually Marx, right? And yet, because they have been socialized so falsely that it is almost impossible for them to see that, right? But again, this is what we need to do. We need to actually educate all of them, right? And so I do understand that, you know, and I don't, as much as at the personal level, right, that I am frustrated at, you know, Trump supporters and so on and so forth. As an educator, do we not have the moral obligation to educate everybody?
Right.
Right? And that really doesn't matter whether or not I am nice to them, right? You know,
right.
But I don't. When we educate, we don't demonize poor white folks, right? Our goal is to be able to show clearly the reality that they have not been able to construe correctly.
Because what they're thinking of is that their perception of reality, there always seems to be some sort of like, but why is it still me or something like that? There always seems to be this missing link, and they don't realize that it's because the same people who have been telling them about this are the ones who have been duping them the whole time. It's like you have to absolutely deconstruct that equation. It's like the reason why I'm this way is because, let's say, like affirmative action, because they're telling me this without realizing that the same people who are telling them these things are the same people who are saying, oh, well, yeah, it's completely fine for corporations to not pay taxes, but God forbid if we extend unemployment until December or something like that, you know.
Mhm.
Sure.
Recognizing the
Sure,
hypocrisy,
sure.
it's recognized. Yeah, I mean, there's many examples, but recognizing the hypocrisy, I think, is the main thing. And that also becomes the other challenge. I know we're kind of swaying off the topic, but then like, how would we as educators, because their view of us and their lens is like, okay, we are like liberal elite college students and professors and activists and all that kind of stuff. Like, how do we know what their lives are like? You know what I mean? So how do we then get to relate to them on a more personal level? You know what I mean?
Yes. Right. But that is a different kind of a thing, I think, Declan, than what we are talking about as educators, right?
Yes.
Remember, like I said, if you understand capitalism clearly, I don't really need to know exactly your life experiences as a working class person. Now, those life experiences are going to be unique, of course, right? How would I ever be able to not accept that? But objective reality, like Paulo Freire would suggest, I know what capitalism produces, and it produces misery for people who work and produce, right? So in that sense, I don't necessarily need to hear from somebody, a poor white person, that their lives are miserable. Now, like I said, there may be a particular reason why they're miserable, that which I don't know, but I know overall, most people living in capitalism who are poor or who are workers are intentionally made to be poor. That is the logical outcome of capitalism, right?
Right.
So I don't need to actually know their individual life story for me to actually approach them to say, hey, stop being duped, right? And by the way, it is not only incumbent upon us to try and see if we could educate them. That's why it's considered to be a dialogue, right? If they do not actually want to engage in a dialogue, there really isn't at that point much I could do, right? If somebody does not want to engage in a dialogue with you, right, then what can you do?
Right.
Right? I mean, because the whole notion of engaging in dialogue as human beings, the first level is that we are all human beings first, right? And that's why these people have made historically so many of us into less than human beings, so that the dialogue does not have to be entered into. So I guess, you know what I'm saying? Of course, you know what? It's all upon us, however you want to actually reach out to those people, including poor white folks who are Trump supporters, right? However you want to reach out to them really is up to you, right? But I think however we reach out to them, right, it has to at least include the idea that they have to understand the reality clearly so that they do not continue to fabricate and hold on to those fabrications of lies that are directed at their misery, linking their misery and directing their misery at the wrong groups of people, right?
Right.
Can I actually read this quote that he has on page 65, which addresses this too?
Sure.
So it's
Sure.
the last full paragraph. It says, critical and liberating dialogue, which presupposes action, must be carried on with the oppressed at whatever the stage of their struggle for liberation. The content of that dialogue can and should vary in accordance with historical conditions and the level at which the oppressed perceive reality. But to substitute monologues, slogans, and my goodness, I can't pronounce it. Thank you. For dialogue is to attempt to liberate the oppressed with the instruments of domestication. Attempting to liberate the oppressed without their reflective participation in the act of liberation is to treat them as objects which must be saved from a burning building. It is to lead them into the populist pitfall and transform them into masses which can be manipulated. And I actually think that is really important, especially that first part about at whatever stage of their struggle for liberation,
Sure.
because you're looking at people who are impoverished, right? And you're specifically looking at poor white people who are very much aligning themselves with oppressive structures and policies, right? Who don't want the rich to be taxed the most because we've been fed this lie that everybody can be rich, everybody can be wealthy, right? So that means someday I'm going to be taxed that way. But I think that that piece right there is so important about like meeting kind of everybody at their point for liberation. So that doesn't mean that we sell ourselves. That doesn't mean that we sacrifice or that we sell out. But I do think that it means that we have to be critically reflective as well in the ways of adjusting and tweaking and at kind of what ways we're going to meet with them. And the how is definitely the big question. But I think that's important. And from my experience, I actually find in my classrooms that it's actually harder for me to meet those who supposedly have liberal ideals when they struggle with these ideas than it is even for those who have more conservative ideas when we're having this conversation, because they're so deeply rooted in like, I'm liberal, I'm progressive, so I'm right there, I'm down for the cause. But then when you really start digging into it, it's really hard to kind of be like, no, really, I'm progressive, I'm liberal, I swear, I just don't agree with this. And so it's really hard when you're looking at it kind of even from a even larger than just that. And meeting people kind of at where they are is a challenge, but I like that he touches upon that too.
Mhm.
But here, I think here he really is also talking about the oppressed who are actively engaged, wanting liberation. I'm not too sure the Trump supporters who are poor white, who are blaming everybody else under the sun, really are engaged in wanting liberation.
That's a good point. That's a good point too.
Yeah.
Right? So I think we got to be clear about that too. And that's what I was saying. When you have people who are not interested in liberation of humanity, but simply, right, simply the progression of their own personal, right, for them to actually make a little bit more money and so on, they're not talking about liberation. That's called egotism and individualism.
Right.
Right? So I think, yes, that's why I was saying, as a working class, poor white folks, as a group, of course we approach them, right, as human beings in a humanist way so that everyone can be in some ways liberated. So in some ways, if in fact I'm dealing with a Trump supporter and this person does not want to engage in a dialogue, does not want to engage in liberation, I'm sorry, folks, but you know what? I don't have time for that. But you know what I do have time for? To fight like hell against capitalism, which will then liberate them from this kind of capitalist kind of chokehold that they have on the working class altogether. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So I guess the point is, Declan, I guess the idea is it's really up to you how much time you want to spend. Maybe you actually, are much more patient than I am, and you are able to,
sometimes
talk to, engage with, right? Somebody who is like that.
Right.
Right. But I actually, because they're not engaged in a dialogue or do not want to engage in liberation, there's really not much I could do.
Yeah.
I cannot continue to waste my time with a population that do not want liberation for humanity.
Yeah.
Right.
I guess where if you want to get to like, if we're going to be sociologists here, we're going to try and get to the root of the problem of why they don't want to engage in true liberation or true dialogue. It would really have to start with re-portraying and imagining education and presenting it to poor white and any poor individuals as a class, to say that education not only is just something to get a job, it's something that could be better for you as a human being. And then on top of that, also making education, higher education, completely affordable, if not free, so that way nobody can really have an excuse when they're sitting there at their job, like, I want to try and better myself as a human being. I want to try and go and learn about this, so that way when it doesn't seem like people who are educated are only people who have money, so that's where it becomes the divide.
Right.
Of course. No, I agree. And I will go as far as to say majority of us who are in the higher education, faculty members, I would say majority of us actually hold on to that kind of moniker, the title of, being in a lofty position, which is silly. And yet, you know how it is, right? So that's exactly, I think we actually need to change all of that, because there's still a dichotomy of the learned and the unlearned, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think what you hit on is very good, that in a sense that the structures, the reality that is surrounding us actually has to support the kind of democratic ideas that you're talking about. So yes, we need free education for everybody. We need free healthcare for everybody. We need affordable housing for everybody.
Yeah.
We need free transportation for everybody. We need like food for everybody.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So once those 5 things are met,
done,
right? Then I think, we could get to some other issues, right? But those really need to be met. And obviously those things that are not being met, right, harms people of color disproportionately.
Agreed.
And the poor people disproportionately.
Of course.
Right?
Yeah. If I may, I just wanted to add on, you guys both bring on some excellent points. I think it's very interesting with everything that's, happening this year and stuff like that, because you guys talked about, capitalism, and you guys talked about oppression. And it's very interesting because everybody now is talking about, oh, I'm being oppressed when it comes to, education or whatever else the situation may be. But it's kind of sad and unfortunate that it took a situation such as a pandemic to realize that, capitalism is affecting everybody as well as oppression. And, it's like, why does it have to always come down to, well, I don't care about this unless it affects me directly, when other people have been struggling with this for decades?
I agree. The thing that was scary the most is if we come out of this pandemic in a year and a half or 2 years and we haven't changed anything, like we haven't learned anything,
Yeah.
If we're just like, yeah, well, it's back to normal now. Okay, cool. Like, I'll just drive to work and sit in traffic for an hour and a half. That's fine. Like, how many people do you think are going to want to like after this, like, yeah, I'm like, some people who are able to work from home now who are like, oh, I like this. And then it's like, all right, let's go. Everyone start driving again. It's like, wait, hold on.
Right.
Whoa. No,
Yeah.
like, no way.
Yeah.
On that note, during the eulogy of John Lewis, right? James Lawson gave one of the eulogies, and he was one of the first people that I saw on TV that tied capitalism to racism clearly, right? And he actually was one of the members who John Lewis learned a lot from in terms of strategizing about civil rights movement, right? He was an advisor to Martin Luther King Jr. So if you guys want to look him up, James Lawson, right? And yeah, he says there cannot be peace under capitalism. You cannot have a peaceful society as long as you have capitalism.
Right.
Right? You know, and those are the kind of things. And the crazy thing is, you know, New York Times had a piece, you know, that last piece that John Lewis wrote right before he died and said he wanted to be published, you know, posthumously, you know, and New York Times actually had a big thing on that. And, you know, as much as I love John Lewis, that's the missing point. He actually didn't link capitalism to racism, right? And I think those things go hand in hand. I mean, at the basis, like we said before, right? I don't know if we said that over the weekend or not, Charlene.
It all blends together.
Yeah, the basis to this country's existence is anti-Blackness. That's where this country begins, right?
Yeah.
This country is founded on the concept of anti-Blackness, right? I mean, why was slavery so important, especially for the rise of capitalism, right? I mean, my gosh, capitalism, everybody already knows, right? You increase capital and profit as much as possible without any cost. And we all know what's one of the biggest costs? Wages. So can you imagine, right? Getting all the products and productivity without having to pay wages.
Yeah.
You know, so it's gotta be linked. It has to be linked from all of us, right? We gotta do a better job. Even as minorities, of course, racism is right on top of us every day, right? But it can't just be about racism. It's gotta be the intersections of race, class, gender, sexuality, and everything else. It really has to. It has to.
And I mean, even if you think about like the objectification of various groups in general, it's very tied to that idea, you know, it's very much tied to productivity and value in that, right? If you think about gender, I mean, there's what sociological theories that talk about the human capital model, right? And because, you know, people who can reproduce and, you know, people who, you know, like who have ovaries and you know, in the uterus, for instance, that they deserve less of a value and a worth because they are going to be out of the workforce for X amount of months, right? Depending on which country you're in, or weeks for that matter. But then, you know, then you think about disability. The reason why people who are disabled are so, you know, dehumanized is because they're perceived to not be able to contribute to an economic system, right? Because then they're just, you know, leeching the system with their disability money, because, you know, $800 to $1,200 a month is so much money. So you know, you're right. Like everything that all of the social identities, when they're devalued and dehumanized, very much is tied to this idea of how much can we get out of you and how much profit can we make off of you. And that, I think that's a really important piece to look at.
Sure, absolutely.
I also imagine that, I'm just going off John Lewis again, I imagine that John Lewis probably knows pretty well what the correlation is between race and capitalism, but he would probably want to touch on those subjects with, like, he want to walk on eggshells with that, just because he knows that his reputation with certain individuals, he doesn't want to be perceived as more radical than, we mean, like, he is more radical, or I'd argue maybe, but like he wouldn't want to be perceived as that just because, I don't know, he wants to have his message be more easily digestible to everyone, you know what I mean? When he might come across as too radical, then it's like you immediately close the curtains for some people. But yeah, I know exactly what you're saying. It's like, it doesn't go far enough, but you know.
And there's a level of strategy too, depending on, like, you know, who you're dealing with regularly, kind of like you were saying, Declan, actually, about, like, you know, not wanting to push people out because of your message, and also depending, I think, on your own positionality too, as to like what you can realistically say.
Mm-hmm.
But right, that goes back to that kind of that idea of sociopolitical and philosophical that we always talk about, right? Like, of course, sociopolitically we realize these things, but then how do you push now beyond that?
Yeah. I've even seen people say something like Bernie isn't or wasn't radical enough. It's like, well, shit. If he went around saying what he really thought inside of his head, he never even would have even made it to like the debate stage, you know. So.
All right.
Like I've come to accept that like there are some things in my lifetime that I might never see, but it's in regards to like equality or equity or whatever you want to call it. But same thing. It saddens me because how many people who fought and died for or marched for certain civil rights that we take for granted now didn't live to get to see that, but they know that they were trying to make it better for like the next generation who was going to be around after them. So there are going to be, hopefully, I mean, historically, I hope so, but like, there are probably going to be some changes like in 50 years or even beyond our lifetimes that we might not get to enjoy, but knowing that we had to start here, you know, like if our end goal is, let's say like whatever it might be, we know that we're only getting to get to like a tenth of that. And then the next generations after us are going to be
Right.
that next tenth and keep going and going and going. And the same thing, it's like every I think as far as it goes with society in regards to how much social progress is how much we can take at one time, you know. Like imagine if all the people who were like middle-aged middle-aged whatever, working class, middle class, high class, whatever, in like 1940s and 50s, if they saw how schools were completely more segregated or desegregated now, and the fact that we had like a black president, all that kind of stuff, they would probably freak out. But it's more palpable now, or it's more it's easily digestible now. And I think just at least on the symbolic level, going from a black president like Barack Obama right back to a guy like Donald Trump is pretty symbolic to show that we're not as ready as we might have thought we were as a country to move forward with certain things, you know, on a more symbolic level, not even so much policy, but just as like what the face of our country is and what we really feel inside, you know.
You know, one thing.
Alvin? No, go ahead, Charlie.
No, it's okay. Yeah, no, I mean, like if other people, Calvin or Rihanna or Rachel, or Z Lees has anything to say, if you want to join us, like, you know, you can talk about your own experiences or, you know, thoughts and opinions on what we're discussing. I'm just gonna listen. Thank you though. So, oh, Rihanna, you unmuted yourself. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, sorry. I think that this is a very good topic, and I feel that we have a long way to go as a society, especially here in the United States. You know, I know that right now, like one of the most talked about topics in the media is the whole, like, you know, stimulus bill that they're trying to pass, hopefully by the end of the week. And it's very interesting though, because you would think that something such as, like, you know, an additional $600 being added onto unemployment wouldn't be that big of a deal. But I don't think that what Congress is really talking about, or not enough people are talking about, is, like, you know, the crackdown on, you know, inflation and capitalism. Because maybe, you know, so many people wouldn't be dependent on this money if more people were having more livable wages and
Yeah,
opportunities and whatnot.
yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
No, I think
Two thumbs up for Rihanna.
no, absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah, definitely.
Go ahead, Charlene.
I'm trying to contemplate, like, kind of go through what my thoughts were, because it was directly tied to that. So I mean, I think one thing that kind of always circles back, or it like kind of always like repeats in my mind, is that idea that we touched upon a couple of weeks ago, from a sociological perspective, right? That like, you know, though those who have created the systems and institutions and structures to be the way they are, right, kind of we end up being the result of that. And if we are looking at challenging those things, we're seen as illogical, right? So you think about people still who don't understand, you know, protesting, and they say, oh, well, if you really cared about protesting, you wouldn't be blocking a freeway. And it's like, okay, so that's you completely missed the point. Like nobody, anyway, my point is that like these systems were designed to intentionally make it to where if we question it, right, we see it as illogical. And that is a product of many different things. But, you know, if circling it back to education, I think a lot about how like my role is to not get my students to agree with me per se, but to really start make them like question what they hold as true, what they've been taught, right? I mean, you see in 5-year-olds getting gold stars, right? Really starting that idea of meritocracy from the get-go. Right? Or how well they behave or comply will get them the green card or the gold stars, additional gold stars. And so I think that, you know, we don't even realize it, but we're automatically training, you know, kids to be compliant to a system that did not have most of them in mind. And so I completely agree with what you're saying, Rihanna, and everybody so far, right? That right, if we had a better quality of life, and instead of being, you know, pissed off about, you know, the people who have to work while people are getting money, like we should just be pissed off that everybody is being, you know, being dehumanized to the get-go. And I kind of think about how much like even something as simple as, you know, symbolic, though yet symbolic, a gold star is, that's a dehumanizing act, right? And so I mean, kind of bringing it back to the book, we don't have to focus on the book, but what stood out to me is on page 81. It's the first full paragraph on that page, and he says, whereas banking education anesthetizes and inhibits creative power, problem-posing education involves a constant unveiling of reality. The former attempts to maintain the submersion of consciousness. The latter strives for the emergence of consciousness and critical intervention in reality. And that one really stood out because for me, you know, I had students who are not college age, they're younger. And when, you know, the murdering of George Floyd happened, they were supposed to be doing math. And I remember I was kind of working with them because during that time I ended up being a math teacher and an art teacher and an English teacher, and a little bit of everything for a bunch of my students. But I sat with them and they were supposed to be doing math because it was due and it needed to be done. But I couldn't force them to do it no matter how important it was at that point, because it was like math worksheets. Not that math's not important, and not that like doesn't contribute to a great deal of important things in our world. But when they turned to me and they showed me live footage of protest shortly after George Floyd's murder, we stopped what we were doing and we started talking about that. And I just kind of thought about like, what would that look like in a classroom, right? So I was sitting with them doing like social distance learning because the schools had already been closed. But like, what would that look like in a classroom? And then my next question is, would that happen in a classroom? Think about all the times that kids are, I mean, like, and we do it in college too, right? Like where we get angry at our students for being on their phones, and rightfully so. I mean, I right. But at the same time, like I think about it, it's like, if that student wasn't on her phone at that moment, right, there was no consequence, then maybe in my classroom or another teacher's classroom, they'd be talking about it. But what about a classroom where they're talking about instead, I don't know, Hamlet, or not that, you know, there aren't important themes in there, but now they have an entire real situation that is impacting them and their daily lives, right, that they're not talking about. And then they're going to go home and they're going to talk about it with their families, which is important too, but then that's it. And so I really started thinking about that in relation to like the classrooms, like, and how much we tend to just like want to stick to the plan and stick to the syllabus and make sure that we're not disrupting our lesson plan, when this is real. Like, this is not just history, but this is like literally life and death for some of our students, right? yet the function of education as an institution, or the function of schooling for that matter, is to make them compliant. And why in the world would you want to introduce protest and the importance of it when your role is to try to reinforce compliance?
Yeah.
And I don't think many teachers recognize that, right? They become agents for compliance. They can become agents of, the status quo.
I do have some one experience that's similar to that. When I was in 7th grade, so I was lucky enough to grow up in La Jolla, and my parents just rented houses there. But when I was in 7th grade, this was 13 years ago, there's this big thing. For those of you here in San Diego, you might remember this. There was this case where this one kid he's younger than I am now. He's 24, I'm 26, but his name was Emery Kanahui. He was a local surfer, and he grew up in the area, but he got into this altercation. He got into this fight with some guys and outside of his mom's house, and he suffered pretty bad brain injury. He got punched badly, hit his head on the concrete, went to the hospital, was in a coma, and died a few days later. But the point I'm getting at is after that had happened, I don't remember the exact timeline. I don't remember if this happened in class after the incident or after he died, but I remember shortly thereafter, I was in a math class, ironically enough, as you said that, and my teacher, Mr. Tyndall, we just didn't talk about math that entire day. We just talked about that and what it felt to us, because like we're you're lucky. Middle class and affluent communities are very lucky to not have to deal with something like gang violence, or they have a lot of resources that we don't have to call the police, and a lot of things we've learned with the defund the police cries. But to have something like, how could something like that happen where like people get into a fight? And there's a lot of backstory to it, so I can explain it later. But the point is like it was refreshing, and it was good to know that there's a teacher who knew that this is something that shook the community. Like I lived literally like a block and a half away from where it happened, and it was just, it made you think like, how could this happen where like some kid gets beat up to a bloody pulp and he dies 2-3 days later in a coma? And like we have to rethink how we're like raising our kids in this environment. Like where do they go wrong? Like what are we doing wrong now? And so like it freaked a lot of people out. Like how could this happen? And so I was lucky enough to have a teacher who was there for like one entire day, just like an hour-long math class. We just talked about that and what it meant to us and what we felt about it and all that kind of stuff, and just things we know, things we heard, and just stuff like that. So I think it is important. Like, and I think it's kind of like something maybe we've talked about in these discussions before, maybe in like Chay's class and previous lectures or whatever. It's like, if something like gas prices fluctuate with what's going on with inflation, all that kind of stuff, why can't wages, for instance? And so that also goes back to what we're talking about with this. It's like, why can't lecture plans fluctuate with what's going on in current events? If we were going to talk about something if we're going to relate, let's say like the banking method to what I had planned to talk about for today, but we realized, there's going on in the world right now that is really important that we should talk about, that relates to what's going on, like what you said, Charlene, with George Floyd or whatever. It's like that should take priority. It's like, who cares about if we focus on like long division right now? It's like, what are you feeling? That's where teachers and educators should be there for their students.
Right. No, I fully agree. And then like also even going a step further and like, okay, so I think a good first step is definitely addressing the big events for sure, for sure, because they impact our students. And then for me, it was like the going a step further too of like, it's great to see all the teachers, especially white teachers, to come forward and see this, and address this particular event. But now that they have their black squares up, now what? What's it going to look like now in the fall? Right? Like, great, you put your black squares up for Blackout Tuesday, but now what? So I think it's great that you had that one teacher. What grade were you in?
I was in 7th grade.
7th grade. Yeah, I think it's awesome because I remember I had some teachers. What the biggest event of my life was 9/11, and I was in the 8th grade. I remember going that morning, and it was a very, interesting day. But I remember really only one teacher addressing it, because it was, secondary school. And so I had multiple subjects and only one teacher addressed it. The rest went on the day as if it was normal. 9/11, same thing like with your situation, right? Like a kid dies, and like, how can you just go along with the day like it's normal? Like, it's just business as usual. Like, how can you do that?
Yeah. And yeah, I don't know. I was in second grade for 9/11, so I remember the kids talking about it on the playground, like, because none of us knew what was going on, right? We were too young, and obviously the parents aren't going to explain domestic, or not domestic, but like explain foreign terrorism and like all this kind of stuff, and like foreign policy and all that. But like, we were just like, oh yeah, like I thought like the pilots were drunk or something. My dad just at that point said, yeah, like just said like, yes, he wasn't in control, just so that way I wouldn't have to think about it. But yeah, it is important. You have to also know like what grade, like, can an 8-year-old comprehend terrorism or comprehend like murder right now? It's like, do you want to bring that up? Like, okay, maybe this is getting back to the subject, but I remember seeing something like, there are some points where it's like, where people think they're doing the right thing to maybe bring certain topics to the table in schools or education, or whatever. But sometimes I think people might be taking it too far, or not so much taking it too far, but saying the wrong thing. I was going down, like, this is maybe a year or so ago, but I remember I was going down the rabbit hole of Instagram and finding just like all these like progressive education kind of things, like talking about how they're going to be more inclusive in schools and all that kind of stuff. And I remember this one person or whatever had this little small essay talking about how it is important to talk about racism, but not even only that, but, and she wrote this, she says something like, I, as like a white educator, I think we have to, ourselves as white educators, have to introduce ourselves as like racist to students and all that kind of stuff. And I'm thinking, wait, you want to introduce yourself as racist? Like, that's going to, like, for like second graders, like, well, that's going to completely mess with their head. It's like, maybe say something like say something like, okay, I benefited from racist policies like that. There's white privilege. It's like, okay, but can even second graders understand that? It's like, there's just, they have to understand, like, when's the right time to like talk about this, like,
right.
Maybe you ask students, what do you know about this? What have your parents told you about this kind of stuff? But that thing just kind of, it's just like, how like when some fucking like white liberal people try and do some weird shit, and it's like no, just start from here first. Don't say like, yes, I am like racist. Like, no, you're not racist. Like, you just benefited from this shit. Like, what? slow down.
Yeah, you make an interesting point of view there, because it's like, let's compare 9/11 to the George Floyd situation. Like, I do agree to a certain extent, like, it's kind of hard to explain to, like, 8-year-olds, like, basically what led up to that event. And then, of course, you have the conspiracy theories behind 9/11, which doesn't help either.
No.
Now, as far as racism concerned, like what grade do you guys remember, like, learning about, like, slavery and the civil rights movement and all that? I feel that for me, being a person of color, it's like, that's something that gets taught to you at a very young age. Like, for example, it's just like, be very careful what you do in the store, because somebody might think that you're stealing because this is how you look and that's how it is. And so I actually had a conversation with Charlene a few months back, when all this stuff was going on, because I have a godson who is biracial. And I said, I was wondering, when is the right age to be able to have the talk with him? Because he's 7 years old. And I just said, I'm very concerned about him and stuff like that, because it's like, you don't want to place that sort of fear in a child's head, but at the same time, that's a reality.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? And so it's just like, I think the bigger question is like, how do you explain that subject to children to where they're able to understand, but they're not traumatized?
That's just something we have to learn and figure out.
Absolutely.
There's not even going to be like a cookie cutter thing. Like, this is the way you're going to explain it to every city in the country, because whatever, the way people are raised in certain areas and demographics of a certain city or neighborhood are way different.
Right.
So.
And it's going to be interesting to see how this particular event, amongst other ones, are going to be published in like history books from 20 years from now, even if they do get published in history books.
Yeah.
So
Some
Can
people
I
would
ask a
call.
question?
Go ahead, Jeff.
This may, no, I was gonna just say along those lines, this may actually, I don't know if it will help us to locate when we actually can do something. What if, hypothetically speaking, there were child molesters, pedophiles running around the streets all day long, all the time, everywhere, and just about everyone is that? When would we actually talk to our children, or what would you think we would do?
that's a good subject.
No, the reason why I'm asking this is,
Go ahead.
the reason why I'm asking this is because I think we still live in a country where, because racism seems to haunt only certain particular group of people, that it is now on, the onus is on that particular group to not only try to fight off the racists, try to protect our children from the idea of racism, and so on. The reason why I brought that up is because if in fact there is child molester, pedophiles, and so on, do you think people will just remain and only worry about when do I bring this subject matter to my children? Or do you think that everybody would actually be out there making sure that we no longer have predators out there by tomorrow? And of course, I would think it's the latter. I would think that if there were child molesters, pedophiles, and so on, everywhere, every day, and so on, we would do something to stop that right away.
Right.
And yet we're not doing this with respect to racism. And this is where I think the question then comes of, are we actually fighting on behalf of humanity, or are we just selectively turning our heads and attention away because it doesn't impact our family?
Right.
Right? And this is where we really have to call on the moral compass of everyone, especially the white folks who live here in the United States. But not only white folks, Asian Americans, and other minorities who also have adopted, right, individualism, assimilation, and the idea of whiteness, where we really do not think that racism harms or impacts all of us, right? This is why, you know, again, and I know this, Charlene's gonna be probably sick and tired of hearing me say this, right? But the question really has to be, has humanity been violated, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if racism violates humanity, then it's all of our problems, as if there is a freaking child molester out there preying on all of our children, right? I mean, really, it has to be that palpable. It's got to be where I am freaking out about racism because it is destroying my fellow brother or sister, my fellow nephew or niece, right? And eventually my fellow humanity. So I think, you know, as long as we actually continue to fight or argue almost at the micro level, right? I think we're not only missing out on the bigger picture, but also engaging in a lot of energy, almost like what they would say, right? It's like empty calorie energy, right? Because for me, my job, right, while it's twofold, I don't want to see an individual racist walking down the street calling people names. Of course not, right? So when I see that, I'll address that too. But it's gotta be also the structure, like Rihanna was saying, right? About if in fact we had better wages, right? Would millions of us be worried about whether or not they're going to extend the $600 per week unemployment benefits?
Mm-hmm.
Right? So I agree, to a certain thing that Declan was saying about, hey, maybe we will not be able to see it in our lifetime, but we actually have to fight like hell as if it's going to actually change tomorrow, right? Change today. And I don't know, we may not see it, but I think somebody mentioned, was it Calvin last time who brought up that quote, that it is a historical fight, that this is a fight, right? Because this is an institution that was created to be this way for over 400 years, right? We know we got a long ways ahead of us to fight,
Yeah.
but we do have to be very clear in, our goals of what we're fighting for, right? And who are our enemies, right? And our enemies might be not simply individuals, but more so ideologies, patriarchy, capitalism, and hegemony, right? That continue to socialize us to be able to witness something that is horrific, such as racism or sexism or homophobia, and still be okay with that as if that's part of the norm, right? So when violence has become normalized, then it becomes really, really difficult. And I think that's what part of the last straw of George Floyd's murder, right?
Mm-hmm.
That his murder was so normalized, right? In broad daylight, right? A
Yeah.
man was murdered in broad daylight, sanctioned by the state, right? And the person who did it in a matter of fact. He was not breathing heavily. I'm talking about the police officer. He was not in a fit of rage somehow because George Floyd insulted him or fought back. It wasn't even that. It was so rational in the way he murdered another human being, right? And yet, millions of Americans are still shouting, shouldn't all lives matter? Right? Yeah, so you know what? Absolutely, everyone here on this, Zoom, as educators, man, we have our work cut out for us, right? So that's why, what I said, all those methods, all those, strategies should never be taken off the table. So I don't know, right? The way, you're going to teach Declan, Calvin, Rachel, Charlene, and Rihanna, and myself, but we cannot take any of those things off the table. But we know, that we really do have our work cut out for us, So, I mean, I don't want this to feel as though that, I am a cynic. Absolutely not. I am so hopeful, right? I am so optimistic of change, right? But that is because I know that, there are at least 7 faces here that are willing to fight and that are preoccupied with these kind of things, right? And I'm sure that there are hundreds and thousands of more of us. And of course, you could tell, right? They're on the street right now, right? Many of them. And others are writing, others are interviewing, others are drawing, others are painting, others are thinking, others are writing poetry, others are singing, others are writing lyrics. So I mean, there's so many things, that we are doing, that I actually am so optimistic. But I agree with Paulo Freire, we've got to be clear. Every time we actually start to wander, we got to almost get ourselves back and be clear. We got to be, I don't know, almost regimented more than we've ever been before in our thought processes, right? Because in some ways, we don't have time to just let our mind wander off And I'm not suggesting that, we shouldn't imagine, not at all. We should imagine a new world always, right? I'm just saying we have to be maybe even more disciplined now as educators, as teachers, as comrades, as friends, as community members, as family, that we got to be even more disciplined. We don't have time. We don't have time anymore, right? To not be disciplined. We have a crazy person telling everybody that it's going to be okay. And we have over 150,000 people dead, right? That's all, many of them are on his hands. And yet he still says it's going away, right? So, I think it is. We are in a situation where things are urgent, not only with respect to race, but also with class and also with health, and many of these kind of things. So I really appreciate that each of us are going to be fighting like hell for this, and against, a tyrant like Trump.
So I kind of want to touch upon a few things you mentioned about like hope, right there, Che, that like you don't want to be perceived as being like a cynic. And I think that sometimes it can be very stressful to, it can be very stressful, and where we sometimes feel that way. But I think that, it kind of tying what you said in with what Declan said too, about like, and what Rihanna said, like the question of when. When do we start engaging these conversations? When do we start talking about them, and how to do it appropriately is important, especially within kind of the systems that we are working in right now. But I think also if we view the younger generations as a sense of hope, so that way we don't, because eventually it does get to a point where we just feel very cynical and we feel very negative, and we're not going to see the change, even though there is change happening. I think sometimes seeing the young ones as a sense of hope, but also being able to see them as a way of like of not undermining youth's knowledge of what's going on, because I think that ends up happening a lot too. And so if you think about the way that kids are automatically indoctrinated to believe the system that we're in now, right? The system that is in place, then, and that is not questioned, then why couldn't we start forming critical views in them young? And then that in turn can become a view of hope, a sense of hope. And it's funny that you touched upon that particular age group too, Declan, because before my kids started school this last year, I actually homeschooled my oldest one for a couple of years. And the word capitalism has been in his vocabulary since he was 5. And we went to the Natural History Museum one time, and he said, yeah, Che has known my oldest one since he was 18 months old or so. Maybe closer to 2, but since he was little. And the first time that he developed like a real critical view, he was 5. We were at the Natural History Museum, and we'd already talked about what capitalism was. And, granted, he doesn't necessarily have it in terms of like the full scope of where we do, but he said, Mom, I wish capitalism wasn't around anymore. And I said, me too, bud, me too. And he goes, no, because then the earth wouldn't be so sick. He had put together the two already, that, money, that like companies were making profit off of things, and it was causing environmental degradation. And like, granted, not in that language, right? But he had already put together that people were profiting off of the earth, and that profit translated into capitalism. He had put the two together. And he was 5, and even now he still is he's 8, he'll be 9 in November. And, and my youngest one, she's 6, and she was actually giving a lesson she gave his speech therapist a lesson on gender binaries, basically, because she had said that, women shouldn't, my daughter was 5 at the time, and my son's speech therapist was playing Guess Who. And he had said, does your character have a mustache? And the woman said, yes, his speech therapist. And so then he goes, is your character a woman? And she goes, no, women should never have mustaches. And my kids looked at her and they're like, well, some women might have mustaches. She goes, oh no, they shouldn't. And they were like, well, some might, and it's really not nice to make fun of them. And so, like, that was a very beginning start. So I want to hope I haven't ruined my children, but, but like, and cause like a sense of negativity, but I see it as a way of hope, right? Them being able to critically engage with that stuff. And one last anecdote, like one last, like, kind of little thing is, I don't know if I've shared this with you, Che, but I did share it with Calvin. My son and I probably about 4 months ago, we were driving, maybe a little longer now at this point, and my son was sitting in the back seat, and we were just talking, and he goes, "Mom, why can't we have more robots?" And I said, "What do you mean more robots?" And he goes, "Well, like, why can't we make more robots out there?" And I said, "Well, there's a lot of robots." And he said, "No, but I mean, like, why can't we make more robots so that way they can do most of the work for us and we can have more time for fun?" And can I tell you, in my, like, that was a moment of like, whoa, like, that's a concept that people cannot fathom when we get self-checkouts, right? Because immediately we shifted, they're taking jobs away, as opposed to seeing it as potential for more leisure time.
Right. Well, in
or
this
more
day,
time to do other work.
yeah, and unfortunately, in this day and age, we're not going to look at something like self-checkout as like, yeah, like we have more leisure time, because in reality is
Right.
somebody's losing their job, you know.
Right.
And I get frustrated. I don't have to go to self-checkout, and it's like, you know, I just rather just do, you know. But yeah, it's I personally, I was very lucky to. It's not like something my dad or mom sat me down and taught me about, like transgender or something like that. But when I was younger, you know, my dad and mom would explain to me, like, you know, there are some people out there, there are some like guys, or like some men who like men. Like, you know how sometimes you might think a girl's cute. It's like some men like men and some women like women, or some boys like boys and some girls like girls. It's like, okay, it's like, and they just say like, that's just, you know, that's what the way they are. That's like, that's what it's inside. Like, I don't know exactly what words was, like, that's what's inside their head, but it wasn't portrayed to me as like a deformity. It's like, some people, that's just the way some people are. Some people like that. I'm like, oh, okay. And I just didn't really think much of it, but just to sort of prep me for like, oh, okay, so some men like other men, like, okay. And same thing with like some people, like they look like they're a man on the outside, but inside sometimes they think they're a woman, so they might want to dress like a woman. It's like, okay. And you know, maybe in my 8-year-old mind it is perceived as like kind of odd or something, but like it's not something that it wasn't something that I pushed back on. It was just sort of something that I sort of accepted, which is also kind of a dangerous thing, because you realize at that point when you're 8, your mind could be completely molded to think whatever. But it makes me think, like, at that stage, you know, when you're 6, 7 years old, like, it's probably not a bad idea to introduce the idea of like racism in like very small chunks, to say something like, unfortunately there are some, like, we're very lucky, like for me being a white dude, it's like we're very lucky to live in a community where we have a lot of, you know, resources and stuff, and whatever. And just to portray, like, I remember, oh, actually I don't remember this, but my dad remembers one time I was driving around with him and his friends who were musicians, and both of them were black dudes. And I was sitting next to them, and me with my white skin, my arm was up next to theirs, and I was maybe 3 or something. And I said, "Hey, your skin is different than mine." And my dad turned back to him like, "Hey, I'm sorry, Linville, I haven't really explained like race to him yet. You know, he's only 3." He's like, no, it's okay, you know. But then just turned into like, yes, but you know, we're still human. You know, we're still the same. We still have hearts and we have blood and stuff like that, you know. But stuff like that, I think it can easily be done, but obviously to maybe explain systematic inequalities and private prison populations and like all that kind of stuff to an 8-year-old, maybe not, but understanding something like, okay, this, yes, it's real. The skin color, it's real. Should it mean anything? No, but unfortunately, based on history, it has and stuff. And I think the first times I've heard of the civil rights movement and maybe Civil War and stuff was probably elementary school, when we learned about Martin Luther King and learned about what he did, and maybe like JFK as well, and RFK. But again, it was sort of perceived as like, Martin Luther King did this, a bad person didn't like him, so he was killed. And then after that, people saw him as a hero because he died for what he believed in. It was sort of perceived as like, pretty much from that point on, like, oh, it was good, you know. And is that enough for a 9-year-old to understand, or should they understand more about redlining and stuff? I don't know.
Yeah, you know, I don't know if they it's a matter of, you know, you're right. I don't know if they should learn more about redlining, but I think, you know, kids are very, very aware and smart, right? So if they are actually taught about, again, like we always talk about, right and wrong, but not as a simple fancy, right? What I mean by that is I think just about every single one of us teaches our kids about stealing, right? That stealing is wrong, right? But then we do it in such an abstract manner that it really means nothing, right? You know, so I think we should be, if we are teaching them about stealing, not just give them an idea of stealing your neighbor's skateboard or going into a store and stealing a bag of chips, right? But why wouldn't we be able to also give them examples of one person actually stealing 95 marbles and 99 people having to play with 5 marbles, right? I mean, I think we really need to like impress these kinds of moral ideas onto them, but not in such an abstract matter that at the end it doesn't really matter, right? Everybody understands stealing's wrong, but when it comes to reparation for African Americans, oh my goodness, right? Majority of the country goes up in arms. Well, but I thought you actually understood that stealing is wrong. And we stole not only their labor, not only their families, their culture, but we stole their humanity as well. And yet, when it comes to paying back what you stole, all of a sudden we're all discombobulated. And this is what I guess I'm saying, right? So, you know, I don't know to the specificities of what we should talk about or not. That's, I guess, also up to the individuals, right? And also children are different. I have 2 boys and they all mature at different levels, right? So of course, so it's really individual at that level. But I think with concepts, it cannot just be something so abstract that it becomes meaningless, right? That it becomes meaningless. Because even the Trump supporters, I guarantee you, when they were bringing up their children when they're young, they would tell them about fairness. And they would talk to them about sharing, right? Now, all of a sudden, when you talk about sharing, they're first ones to call you a socialist and a communist. So what do those stories even mean, right? If they're not really linked with something that is clear and objectifiable and something that becomes meaningful, right? So I guess, you know, I don't know to what specific things that we could talk to them about, but I am sure that we can talk to them about, you know, certain concepts, but those concepts need to be made real, right? So that, you know, like Charlene's kid is able to connect the dots, right? I don't know, you know, I don't have any answers. I'm struggling as much as anybody else, right? In talking about these to my children, right? But yeah, but both my wife and I have decided that we're not going to shelter them away from these kinds of things, right? So yeah, they actually, you know, hear these things. We try to explain it as best as we can, right? And try to let them know, you know, that yeah, they gotta actually, you know, whatever it is that they learn, they gotta actually act on it. But anyway, yep, it's already 8:30, folks.
Thank you for everybody. Thank you to everybody for joining us for this week. If there's more thoughts, you know, feel free to say them. I'd love to continue this conversation next week. We are going to start venturing into chapter 3 of Pedagogy of the Oppressed. But I also am going to send out a few other things, or if you have other things that you'd like to share with us as well, that kind of touch upon some of the kind of structural oppressions that we've talked about, that you want to kind of dive into deeper. Please feel free to bring them, and we can talk about those as well. Yeah, if anybody has anything else to say, let it say it, and then we can always reconvene next week.
I'll say one more thing, just a smaller example, and then I'll stop. I remember one other time, or a few times when I was a kid, is when my dad and I, we'd go pick up food for our family for dinner or whatever it was. We go to this place called Marketplace Grill. and it was Mediterranean food. And then right next door was a liquor store where we get like drinks, like lemonade or something. And I asked my dad, like, because they had drinks in Marketplace Grill, I said, why don't we get like the lemonade and iced tea? Why don't we get it at that store? He said, well, I want to get it from this store. You know, I want to. He said this term, like, I want to spread the wealth. I buy the food here, but I support this business and I buy their drinks. You know, I want to spread the wealth. And to me, it's like, oh, that makes sense. And I didn't think about something in regards to like capitalism, but just introducing that little idea of like, I buy my sandwich here, I'm gonna buy a drink here, so it's not all in one place. It's like, that makes sense, you know, to a 7-year-old kid or whatever. It's like, yeah, that makes all the sense in the world to me.
Sure. Sure.
I think I'll just make one last comment too, and then we can wrap it up. Or if anybody else would like to say anything, I think that's a really good point, Declan. And it was something that was kind of going through my head when you first posed the question of like when and how is appropriate, right? I think that at some point we do and should, like, I think having those conversations, the big structural, you know, kind of critical analysis is important as you get to a certain point. But I think at a younger age, as Dr. Che was saying, like, it depends on the individual kid and the family and stuff. But I think at some point also just normalizing it, like,
Yeah.
just right, like you said, like the kind of like, oh, why? And then the explanation, like, okay, cool. And then you don't necessarily have to have a heavy conversation at that point in your, at least you're in your individual experience, and maybe it becomes normalized, right? Just like Dr. Che has brought up historically about how like representation is important, right? But then representation is what we're aiming for. But I think representation is important because of that reason, like as that step of normalization, right? Representation of, you know, of positive Black characters and stories, and representation of disabled kids and stories, and representation of, you know, non-stereotypical Asian characters and stories, and really kind of having that as a normalized action as well is a good starting point for younger kids, because
Yes.
then, right, there isn't like, of course we're going to have some sort of bias according to like the structure, and we're going to recognize that policies and practices are there. But if you normalize that as good and people as good, and you humanize people, then maybe there is some more hope, right? And it doesn't become such a daunting task as they get older, because then you're like, you're able to introduce those things in a different way. My daughter, we just got new
Sure.
guinea pigs. So, so if anybody has anything else they'd like to say, otherwise we'll go ahead and wrap up tonight's session.
Show us the guinea pig.
Oh, hold on, I'm gonna stop.